Today, Four-Legged Loyalty brings you a story set in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, a place where vast pine forests, rugged trails, and unpredictable fogs test the loyalty of a German shepherd named Shadow and his companion, Sergeant Danny Harper. This is German Shepherd finds missing soldier in an unexpected circumstance, a story of friendship, loyalty, and survival on the thin line between life and death. Daniel Harper, known as Danny, is a 29-year-old sergeant in the United States Army, stationed at a small base deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, about 150 miles east of Sacramento. He was not a soldier who stood out among the hundreds of men on base, 5 feet 10 inches, built but not too muscular, with short brown hair cut in a military style and deep blue eyes that wore a brooding expression as if concealing thoughts he rarely shared. His face was tanned from days spent training outdoors, with a few faint lines at the corners of his eyes, remnants of jogging in the Oregon sun and sleepless nights in the Sierra Nevada. Danny came from a small town called Sisters, nestled in the pine forests of central Oregon, where winding rivers, lush forests, and peaceful afternoons fishing with his father had shaped his childhood. His family was not wealthy, living in a small log house with a steep roof and an old fireplace, where his father, Tom Harper, was a lumberjack and his mother, Ellen, worked at the town fishing store. Danny is the second of 3 children. His older brother, Ryan, 4 years older, has left Sisters to work as an engineer in Portland, rarely coming home, and his younger sister, Emily, 2 years younger, is in college in Eugene, pursuing a degree in biology with a dream of preserving forests. Danny grew up in tall pine forests, where he would run miles on red dirt roads, his sneakers worn out from afternoons spent exploring with his friends. He was not a good communicator, preferring the quiet of nature to the loud chatter of the city. When he was 18, his father died in an accident in the woods. A large pine tree fell while he was cutting wood, leaving the family in grief and financial difficulty. Danny sat by the fireplace in their cabin, looking at the family photo hanging on the wall, a picture taken the summer he was 12, standing on the banks of the Deschutes River in the golden sunshine, and felt a void that could not be filled. He didn't want to live a life of hanging around Sisters, cutting wood like his father or selling fishing tackle like his mother. He wanted something bigger, a clearer purpose. One winter afternoon, while jogging through the pine woods, Danny stopped at a small gas station and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall, "Join the Army, protect what you love." The words were like a light bulb in his mind, rekindling the desire to protect his country that he had nurtured since he was a child. His father told him about soldiers in World War II. 2 months later, he packed his father's old backpack, an olive green one with frayed straps, a few clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo, and set off for the recruiting center in Bend. He didn't say much when he left his mother. He just hugged her, felt her thin arms shaking on his shoulders, and got on the bus without looking back. When he arrived in the Sierra Nevada in 2022, Danny was assigned to a patrol unit at a small base in the mountains, far from the bustling cities of California. The base was an area surrounded by barbed wire, with tin-roofed shacks and dirt roads running through tall pine trees. He wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M16 rifle, but he was not the most outstanding soldier on the team. He was not as agile as some of his comrades, nor did he have the outstanding shooting skills to be praised. But Danny had one thing that no one could deny: endurance. He could walk for hours through rough forest trails without complaining, could sit still on cold nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of the Sisters, of the days he thought he would never leave. Shadow came into Danny's life one afternoon in April 2023, nearly a year into his time in the Sierra Nevada. Shadow was a German shepherd who had been transferred from a training center in Texas where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Shadow was not the largest of his litter, weighing in at about 75 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches from shoulder to paw, but he stood out for his intelligence and discipline. His coat of Shadow was thick and dark brown, bred to withstand the cold of the mountains and the dust of the trails. His ears were always erect, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the pine trees to the distant roar of a Jeep engine. His bright brown eyes gleamed with a sharp, steady gaze, as if he always knew exactly what he was doing. Shadow was trained to patrol and spot tracks, a necessary duty in the Sierra Nevada, where remote trails were sometimes dangerous to wildlife or trespassers. The first time Danny met Shadow, he was standing in the base's training grounds, in the warm sunlight of a spring afternoon. The training grounds were a large area, surrounded by barbed wire and towering pine trees, with the ground covered in dry leaves and scattered rocks. Shadow was led from the kennel by a trainer named Chris, a man of about 35 with short brown hair and hands tanned from years of working outdoors. Chris wore an olive green military shirt, put a black nylon collar around Shadow's neck, and told Danny that Shadow was a good dog but stubborn, not easily accepting of strangers. Danny looked at Shadow, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, knelt down about 3 feet in front of Shadow, and placed his hand on his head. Danny's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a strange sense of connection. Shadow sniffed his hand, tilted his head, and then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at Danny as if accepting him right then and there. Chris laughed, patted Danny on the shoulder, and told him that Shadow had chosen him. From then on, Danny and Shadow became inseparable. Every morning, as dawn broke through the pine trees of the Sierra Nevada, Danny would take Shadow on a patrol around the area, checking the trails leading into the base. He would throw an old tennis ball, a worn, dirt-covered ball, for Shadow to chase, watching him run with powerful strides, his muscles defined under his fur. Some days, when Danny would sit on a wooden bench in the camp, reading an old book like To Kill a Mockingbird or jotting down scattered thoughts in a small notebook, Shadow would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Danny didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Shadow. "You were great at finding your way today," or "You're my best friend, you know that?" He didn't know if Shadow understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Shadow lifted his head, looking at him with eyes that were shining brightly, as if he wanted to respond. To Danny, Shadow was more than just a service dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he'd lost since leaving Sisters. There were nights when Danny lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old desk. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He remembered afternoons jogging through the pine woods, listening to the wind whistling through the trees, or fishing on the Deschutes River with his father, the smell of fireplace smoke in the air. But every time he looked down at Shadow, curled up on an old blanket next to his bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was the reason Danny kept going, the reason he believed there was something worth living for. The story that Four-Legged Loyalty wants to tell today is not only about Danny and Shadow, but also about an unexpected challenge that tested their loyalty. It took place on an October morning in 2024 when Danny and Shadow participated in a routine training session in the deep forests of the Sierra Nevada. The mission seemed simple, patrolling a 12-mile trail to check the security of the area. But a sudden thick fog caused Danny to disappear, and Shadow, with unwavering loyalty, stayed behind to find him in an unexpected situation. This is not a fictional story. It is told from military reports, from the accounts of the men on the patrol, and from the very scribbles that Danny wrote in his notebook after he recovered. This is German Shepherd finds missing soldier in an unexpected situation. Daniel Harper, or Danny, isn't a big talker, and if someone asks him where he's from or why he joined the military, he'll usually respond with a simple, "From Oregon." Wanted to do something. But behind that reticence lies a long story about growing up in Sisters, a small town nestled in the piney woods of central Oregon, where life seems to revolve around red dirt roads covered in dead leaves, lush forests stretching to the horizon, and peaceful afternoons along the Deschutes River. Sisters isn't a place where people dream big. It's a place where people live slowly, work hard, and rarely leave in search of a different life. Danny was born into a working-class family, not rich but not poor either. His father, Tom Harper, was a lumberjack with rough hands, blackened by turpentine, and light brown hair that had turned gray at the temples from years of hard labor. His mother, Ellen, was a gentle woman who worked in a small fishing shop in the center of town, where she stood behind the counter, selling fishing reels, lures, and bamboo fishing rods to locals and tourists. Danny was the second of 3 children. His older brother, Ryan, 4 years older, was a tall, dark-haired man with a lively personality who had left Sisters when Danny was 14 to study engineering in Portland, then stayed on as an engineer at a construction company, rarely visiting home except for major holidays. His younger sister, Emily, 2 years younger, with her father's blue eyes and sun-kissed light blonde hair, was in college in Eugene, studying biology with dreams of becoming a forest conservationist. Danny, with his short-cropped brown hair and deep blue eyes, was unlike his siblings in that he spoke little, smiled little, and always wore a pensive expression as if he were thinking about something he never revealed. He was not a star student at Sisters High School, but he was always tenacious. He liked to run on the dirt roads around town, often alone, in an old green t-shirt and scuffed sneakers, letting the winter chill or summer heat seep into his skin. He didn't go to the parties or weekend soccer games that the kids and Sisters loved. He just ran, thought, and searched for some meaning in life that he couldn't quite figure out. When Danny was 18, his father died in an accident in the woods. Tom was hit by a large pine tree while he was cutting wood one cold winter afternoon when the wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the icy breath of the nearby Cascade Mountains. Danny was the one who got the news from a coworker of his father's, a middle-aged man with a wrinkled face and hands that shook as he recounted the incident. He raced to the scene, about 5 miles from home, and found his father lying motionless on a bed of dry pine needles, his hands still clutching the axe, his eyes wide open, staring up at the gray sky as if he were trying to say something last. Danny didn't cry at the funeral. He stood silently by the coffin, watching his mother, Ellen, hug Emily and sob, while Ryan put his hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him with words he couldn't quite hear. After his father's death, the family fell on hard times. Ellen tried to make ends meet with a small insurance policy, but her job at the fishing store wasn't enough to make ends meet. Danny started working part-time at a gas station in Sisters, behind the counter, selling cans of beer and bags of chips, but he hated feeling trapped in a repetitive life, a life where he felt like his father, chopping wood to exhaustion and leaving nothing but an old log cabin and a few mementos. Danny didn't want to live like that. He remembered the afternoons sitting by the fire with his father, listening to him talk about his younger days, when he had dreamed of leaving Sisters to work on a fishing boat in Alaska, but had stayed for his family, for his responsibilities. Danny didn't blame his father, but he didn't want to repeat that path. One day, while jogging through the pine woods, he stopped at a gas station and saw a recruitment poster hanging on the wall, "Join the Army, protect what you love." The words lit a small fire in his mind, awakening a desire to defend his country that he had nurtured since he was a child, listening to his father talk about the World War II soldiers he admired. 2 months later, he packed his father's old backpack, an olive green one with frayed straps, containing a few changes of clothes, his father's small folding knife, and a family photo taken on the banks of the Deschutes River, and set off for the recruiting center in Bend. He didn't say much when he left his mother. He just hugged her, felt her thin arms shaking on his shoulders, and boarded the bus without looking back. When he arrived in the Sierra Nevada in 2022, Danny was assigned to a patrol unit at a small base camp in the mountains, about 150 miles east of Sacramento. The base was a barbed wire fenced area with tin roof shacks and dirt roads through towering pine trees. He wore an olive green uniform, a cap, and carried an M16 rifle, but he wasn't the best soldier on his team. He wasn't as fast as some of his teammates, nor did he have the shooting skills to be praised. But Danny had one thing no one could deny: endurance. He could hike for hours on rugged forest trails without complaining, and he could sit still on cold nights to observe without losing focus. He carried his father's folding knife in his pocket, not for protection, but as a reminder of the sisters, of the days he thought he would never leave. Shadow came into Danny's life one afternoon in April 2023, when he had been in the Sierra Nevada for almost a year. Shadow was a German Shepherd transferred from a training center in Texas where dogs were carefully selected for military service. Shadow was not the largest of his litter, weighing about 75 pounds and standing nearly 26 inches from paw to shoulder, but he stood out for his intelligence and discipline. Shadow's coat was thick and black and brown, groomed to withstand the cold of the mountains and the dust of the trails. His ears were always upright, alert to every sound, from the wind whistling through the pine trees to the distant roar of a Jeep engine. His bright brown eyes were sharp and determined, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Shadow was trained to patrol and track, a necessary task in the Sierra Nevada, where remote trails were sometimes dangerous to wildlife or trespassers. The first time Danny met Shadow, he was standing in the base's training yard, in the warm sunlight of a spring afternoon. The training yard was a large area, surrounded by barbed wire and tall pine trees, with the ground covered in dry leaves and scattered rocks. Shadow was led from his kennel by a trainer named Chris, a man in his mid-30s with short brown hair and hands tanned from years of working outdoors. Chris wore an olive green military shirt, put a black nylon collar around Shadow's neck, and told Danny that Shadow was a good dog but stubborn, not easily accepting of strangers. Danny looked at Shadow, sensing the wariness in his eyes. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, kneeling about 3 feet in front of Shadow, and placed his hand on its head. Danny's hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a strange sense of connection. Shadow sniffed his hand, tilted his head, then sat down suddenly, his eyes looking straight at Danny as if accepting him from that moment. Chris laughed, patted Danny on the shoulder, and told him that Shadow had chosen him. From then on, Danny and Shadow became inseparable. Every morning, as the dawn broke through the pine trees of the Sierra Nevada, Danny took Shadow on patrol around the area, checking the trails leading into the base. He would throw an old tennis ball, a worn, dirt-covered ball, for Shadow to chase, watching it run with powerful strides, its muscles clearly visible under its fur. There were days when Danny sat on a wooden bench in the camp, reading or writing something in his notebook, and Shadow would lie down next to him, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed but alert. Danny didn't say much, but he would whisper short sentences to Shadow. "You found your way around well today," or "You're my best friend, you know?" He didn't know if Shadow understood what he said, but every time he spoke, Shadow would raise his head and look at him with bright eyes, as if he wanted to respond. To Danny, Shadow was more than a service dog. He was a companion, a part of the family he'd lost since leaving Sisters. There were nights when Danny lay in his bunk in the camp, a small room with wooden walls, a folding bed, and an old desk. He thought about his parents, about his childhood, and felt a hollow loneliness. He missed afternoons jogging through the pine woods, the wind whistling through the trees, or fishing on the Deschutes River with his father, the smell of fireplace smoke in the air. But every time he looked down at Shadow, curled up on an old blanket next to the bed, breathing steadily, he felt comforted. Shadow was more than just a dog. He was the reason Danny kept going, the reason he believed there was something worth living for. One October morning in 2024, Danny Harper, and Shadow were on a routine training mission deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, about 5 miles west of their small military base. The mission was not unusual for Danny's patrol unit. They were regularly sent out to check the trails in the area, ensuring the safety of the remote mountain terrain near the base, where threats from wild animals like bears and cougars, or occasionally illegal intruders, were always present. But as Danny stood in the base yard that day, watching the jeeps lined up for departure, he felt a vague unease creeping up on him. Perhaps it was the chill of the fall morning, when the temperature was only about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, and the air carried the scent of dry pine needles from the surrounding forests. Or maybe it was the look in Shadow's eyes, his German shepherd who always walked beside him. As he lifted his head to look at him, his ears pricked as if sensing something he couldn't see. Danny wore an olive green uniform, designed to blend into the forested landscape, with a lightweight windproof jacket, spiked trousers, and brown leather boots dusted with dust from past patrols. He wore an olive green cap, the brim frayed from sweat and dirt, and a pair of military sunglasses to shield his eyes from the sunlight that filtered through the trees. Over his shoulder, he carried a small backpack containing the essentials: a scratched plastic water bottle, a pack of dry rations, a small first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, and the notebook he kept with him, where he jotted down his scattered thoughts about life in the Sierra Nevada. At his side was an M16 rifle, the sling frayed at the edges. But he was not a soldier who relied on weapons. He relied more on his endurance and his ability to see than on bullets. Danny was not a showy man. He did not carry the fancy gadgets or luxuries of some of his comrades, who favored GPS watches or noise-canceling headphones, because for him, simplicity was a way to keep his mind focused. Shadow, as always, walked beside Danny. The 75-pound German shepherd had thick, well-groomed black-brown fur to protect against the cold of the mountains and the dust that had collected there. Shadow wore a black nylon collar with a small metal tag bearing his military identification number, S4729. Shadow's ears were erect, his bright brown eyes were alert, and his steps were strong and sure as he walked across the leaf-strewn grounds of the base. Danny looked at Shadow, feeling a strange sense of comfort. He knew that Shadow was more than just a working dog. He was a companion he could count on in any situation, especially in a place like the Sierra Nevada, where every step could lead to an unexpected challenge. Before getting into the car, Danny knelt down and stroked Shadow's head, feeling the dry but soft fur under his hand, dusted with dirt from previous patrols. He didn't think much of it, but he felt that having Shadow by his side was enough to face whatever was coming. Danny's patrol consisted of 5 men, all experienced soldiers, trained to face the dangers of the mountains. The team leader was Sergeant Rob Callahan, a 34-year-old man with short black hair, a sharp face tanned by time spent outdoors, and piercing brown eyes that watched everything with caution. Callahan was stern but dedicated, always putting the safety of the team first, and he had a leadership style that inspired confidence, even though he was sometimes quiet to the point of being cold. The other members of the team included Private First Class Jake Miller, a tall, lean, blonde-haired, cheerful 24-year-old who carried a lighter engraved with his mother's name, Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a petite but agile 28-year-old woman who was good at reading maps and navigating, and another soldier named Eric Torres, a quiet 30-year-old who specialized in communications engineering. The team was fully equipped, Paper maps, handheld signal detectors, walkie-talkies, flashlights, and some survival items such as drinking water, dry food, and a small tarp to use if they had to stay overnight. The trip began around 7 a.m. as the sun peeked through the pine trees, casting a pale yellow light through the thin layer of fog that had settled over the area. The team traveled in two military jeeps, olive green in color, and with large tires designed to handle the rugged terrain of the mountains. Danny sat in the back seat of the second vehicle, next to Sarah, while Shadow curled up at his feet, his head resting on his forepaws, his ears perked up as the road creaked. The road from the base to the mission's starting point was a long one, through tall pine forests with reddish-brown trunks, past small streams that trickled under rocks, and through trails covered in last season's dead leaves. Danny looked out the window, saw the dew on the pine needles glistening in the early morning sunlight, and his uneasy feeling grew more pronounced. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he tried to push it aside, telling himself that this was just a routine training exercise. When the team reached the mission's starting point, a clearing about 5 miles from the base, near a small stream, they got out of their vehicles and began to prepare. Their mission was to patrol a 12-mile trail that led through a deep forest area, a trail that had been suspected of being unusual due to reports from other units of wildlife activity or illegal poachers. Callahan stood in front of the team, map in hand, and explained a plan. "We're going to walk this trail, checking each section for signs of anomalies. Shadow will go ahead to spot anything suspicious. If there's any sign of danger, retreat to the vehicle. The weather is cool today, but there may be fog. Stay hydrated and focused." Danny listened, nodding, but he couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. He looked down at Shadow, who stood still, his ears pricked higher, as if sniffing the cool air of the forest. The team set out around 7:30 a.m. Leaves rustled under Danny's boots as they left the clearing, and the morning chill seeped through his jacket, making him shiver. The temperature was about 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, and the ground was damp with the night dew that had not yet melted. Danny was near the front of the team, with Shadow as usual. He walked at a steady pace, his boots leaving faint footprints in the dry leaves, which were quickly covered by the wind. Shadow walked beside him, his nose constantly sniffing the ground, his eyes alert, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air as if searching for something. The team moved in silence, the only sound being their footsteps and steady breathing in the silence of the forest. Danny could feel sweat beginning to seep through his undershirt, even though the air was still cool, and he knew it was a sign of his inner tension. As the team moved deeper into the woods, the landscape became wilder. The trail led through tall pine trees, their reddish-brown trunks standing straight, their thick foliage blocking out much of the sunlight, casting patches of dappled shade on the ground. Moss-covered boulders dotted the path, and the sound of a small stream somewhere in the distance mingled with the gentle whistling of the wind through the trees. Danny looked up through the gaps in the foliage, seeing the sun higher in the sky, but the light was filtered through a thin layer of mist, making it seem hazy. He turned to look at Shadow, who paused for a moment, his head raised, his ears pricked higher, his nose sniffing the cold air. He thought to himself that Shadow might sense something was wrong too, but he wasn't sure what. Around 8 o'clock, when the team had gone nearly 3 miles, they entered a narrower section of the trail, flanked by low cliffs covered in moss and dense undergrowth. The path was less than 5 feet wide, and the ground was slippery with wet leaves and loose rocks. Danny felt the chill grow more acutely, as if the air were trapped between the rocks, and claustrophobic feeling began to creep up on him. He looked at Shadow, who was more focused than ever, his nose close to the ground, his ears pricked to the max. He felt a greater unease than ever, but he had no time to think about it. Little did he know that in a few minutes the thick fog would roll in, and his life would change forever. As Danny Harper's patrol pushed deeper into the narrow trail between the low cliffs of California's Sierra Nevada forest, the chill of the October morning was still all around. The temperature hovered around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius, and the chilly air carried the scent of dry pine needles and damp earth from the previous night's dew. The trail, less than 5 feet wide, was slick with wet leaves and loose stones that littered the ground, forcing Danny to tread carefully with each step. He wore an olive green uniform, a lightweight windproof jacket that had absorbed some of the dew from the air, dusty thorn-proof trousers, and brown leather boots that left faint footprints in the dry leaves. Sweat was beginning to seep through his undershirt, and despite the cool temperature, he felt a little stifled under his frayed cap. A small backpack on his shoulder held water, rations, and a notebook, and the M16 rifle hung from his waist, the strap rubbing against his neck as he moved, but he paid it no mind, The unease in his heart outweighed any discomfort from the equipment or the weather. Danny walked near the front of the team, with Shadow, his trusty German Shepherd companion. Shadow walked with sure steps, his thick black-brown fur matted with dry leaves and dirt from the road, but his erect ears and bright brown eyes still gleamed with constant alertness. Shadow's black nylon collar, with its metal tag bearing the number 4729, vibrated as he moved, and his nose sniffed the ground constantly, searching for any sign of danger. Danny looked at Shadow, feeling a small comfort amid the cold and the growing tension in his heart. He knew that Shadow was more than just a working dog. It was his second set of eyes and ears, a creature that could detect things that humans couldn't. But even Shadow's presence couldn't completely dispel the unease he carried with him since leaving the base, a sense that something was waiting for them ahead, hidden beneath the towering pines and moss-covered cliffs. The patrol had traveled nearly 3 miles since leaving the clearing, and the narrow path they were on was a narrow path, flanked on either side by low cliffs, about 6 feet high, with a surface covered in green moss and dense undergrowth. The ground beneath Danny's feet was slippery, with small stones rolling under the soles of his shoes, and the dry pine needles formed a thin carpet, hiding dangerous protrusions. The tight space made Danny feel claustrophobic, as if the cliffs were closing in around him, and the cold from the rocks seeped through his uniform, making him shiver. He looked up through the gaps in the pine trees, only to see the sky obscured by a thin layer of fog, the sunlight filtering through, creating faint streaks of light on the ground. He turned to look at Shadow, who paused for a moment, his head raised, sniffing the air, his ears perked up, as detecting something unusual. Danny felt his heart beat faster, but he didn't have time to think about it. Just seconds later, as the team advanced a few steps into the narrow trail, a thick fog suddenly rolled in. It rolled in like a white curtain, momentarily obscuring the team's vision, turning the landscape around them into a hazy world where the pine trees were only vague silhouettes, and the cliffs disappeared into the mist. The air grew heavy, damp, and colder, with the temperature dropping to around 48 degrees Fahrenheit 9 degrees Celsius. Danny felt his breath hitch, not from the cold, but from the suddenness of the situation. He slowed, raising his hand to test the distance between him and Shadow, but in that moment he slipped on a loose mossy stone. He fell forward, losing his balance, and in his attempt to cling to the cliff beside him, he failed to notice a narrow ravine hidden under a layer of dry leaves and wild brush. He fell into the ravine, about 15 feet deep, a natural pit created by years of rain erosion, now covered by tree canopy and topsoil. Danny hit his head hard on a sharp rock inside the ravine, drawing blood from a gash on his forehead, and his left leg was caught under a heavy fallen log, bent at an unnatural angle. He blacked out instantly, his body motionless in the darkness of the ravine, his small backpack torn off at one corner, and his M16 rifle dropped, lying a few feet away in the damp soil. Shadow, who was fortunately a few steps ahead of Danny, was unaffected by the fall, but the dog barked frantically when he realized Danny had disappeared into the mist. Shadow's bark echoed through the forest, full of panic and desperation, as if calling Danny back. The dog ran to the edge of the ravine, claws scratching at the dry leaves and damp soil, trying to dig down to find him, but the thick soil and tangled roots prevented it. Shadow scratched relentlessly, leaving scratches in the soil, but it could not penetrate. Shadow's bright brown eyes were red from the mist and cold, and his black-brown fur was damp from the humid air, but he did not care. In his mind, there was only one goal: to find Danny. The patrol, separated by the thick mist, fell into chaos. The mist not only obscured their vision but also disoriented them, making it impossible to determine each other's exact location. Sergeant Robert Callahan, the team leader, was about 10 feet away from Danny when he fell, but the fog made it impossible to see anything but the faint outlines of his teammates. He yelled into his radio, his voice cut off by the wind and Shadow's barking. "Harper, where are you? Report now." But there was no response. Danny's radio, which was in his backpack, had shattered when he fell, and the signal was gone. Callahan turned to see the other members of the team, Jake Miller, Sarah Nguyen, and Eric Torres, striving to regroup in the fog, their hands clutching their rifles, their eyes alert for any sound around them. Shadow continued to bark, his bark echoing in the canyon, but none of the team could get close enough to check. The fog was so thick they could see only a few feet ahead, and the slippery ground made every step a risk. Callahan knew it was too dangerous to stay here, not only because of the fog, but also because of the treacherous terrain and the possibility of wildlife lurking nearby. He radioed orders: retreat to the car immediately. Call for backup on signal. The team began to move back down the trail, keeping a tight formation to avoid getting lost, but Shadow refused to follow. Jake Miller, the closest to Shadow, ran up, grabbed the dog's nylon collar, and tried to pull him away, but Shadow growled, yanked on a leash, and ran back to the edge of the ravine, barking incessantly. Callahan looked at Shadow, saw the dog's determined gaze, but he had no choice. He ordered the team to retreat without Shadow, knowing they needed to survive to call for help. The team left the area, leaving Shadow alone in the thick fog, with the wind whistling through the pines and the cold seeping into his every breath. At the bottom of the ravine, Danny lay unconscious, his body shaking from the trauma, blood from the gash on his forehead running down his cheek, drying in red streaks on his tanned skin. He didn't know that the team had retreated, didn't know that the wind and fog were closing in on the forest above, and didn't know that Shadow was at the edge of the ravine, determined not to leave. In the darkness of the ravine, a small gap between the soil and the roots allowed air to filter in, carrying moisture from the fog, keeping him breathing, albeit feebly. His backpack lay scattered beside him, his notebook open to the last page he'd written. "It's cold today, but I still made it 8 miles." He didn't have the strength to wake up, didn't have the strength to call out to Shadow, but in his daze he thought vaguely of the dog, hoping that Shadow was safe with the team. On the ground, Shadow didn't care about the cold or the thick fog. It stood at the edge of the ravine, claws digging into the damp earth, leaving deep scratches that it could not dig through. Its barking grew fainter as the cold dried its throat, but it did not stop. Shadow knew Danny was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. Its fur was damp with dew, its eyes red from wind and fatigue, but its gaze was steady, as if to say it would never give up. Shadow stood there, alone in the Sierra Nevada, in the mist and cold, waiting, against all odds, as a testament to its loyalty to Danny, a loyalty that would lead to an unexpected turn of events in the days ahead. After Danny Harper fell into a narrow ravine in a dense fog in the Sierra Nevada forest, the patrol was forced to retreat, leaving Shadow, the faithful German shepherd, alone in the cold mountains. The fog did not clear immediately after the team left. It remained in a blanket of white, obscuring the outlines of the towering pines, the low moss-covered cliffs, and the slippery trail the team had just traversed. The temperature during the day hovered around 48 degrees Fahrenheit 9 degrees Celsius, with a cold, damp air seeping through the layers of dirt and dry leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine resin in the air. Shadow stood at the edge of the ravine where Danny had disappeared, his ears erect, his bright brown eyes now red from the fog and cold, but his gaze unwavering. He barked incessantly, echoing through the trees, weakened by his parched throat, but Shadow did not care. In its mind, there was only one goal: to find Danny, the companion it had chosen to be faithful to since the day they first met. 2 days had passed since Danny had fallen, and Shadow had remained at the edge of the ravine, braving the cold of the day and the bitter cold of the night when the temperature dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit 4 degrees Celsius, making its body shiver under its wet fur. The Sierra Nevada forest was unforgiving to any living creature, and Shadow had no water or food to sustain it. Its thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the cold of the mountains, was now caked with dew and dry leaves, matted in patches, exposing the emaciated body beneath. Its ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched from hitting the rocks during its relentless digging efforts. The bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red and dim from the dew, the cold, and exhaustion, but they still stared at the dirt covering the crevice, as if they could see through it to Danny below. Shadow clawed at the ground, leaving deep scratches in the damp earth and dead leaves, sometimes bleeding where claws made contact with sharp rocks hidden beneath the surface. He tried to dig through more than 3 feet of dirt to reach Danny, but the cold had frozen the ground, and every time Shadow dug a little, the wind blew dry leaves back in, obliterating his efforts. Shadow did not give up. He stopped, panting, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, then clawed again, as if driven by some deep instinct, an instinct of absolute loyalty to Danny. Its legs trembled with cold and exhaustion. The lean muscles that had once propelled it along the trails around the base now shriveled from lack of water and nourishment. Shadow ate nothing but the occasional dry leaf it accidentally swallowed as it sniffed the ground. It drank nothing but the dew that had collected on its fur, which it licked at it. Its red eyes stared at the dirt, and its barks grew weaker by the day, drowned out by the wind whistling through the pines and the rustle of dry leaves in the forest. But Shadow didn't care about hunger, thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing it of its life force. It only knew that Danny was down there, and it had to stay to save him. Down in the ravine, Danny lay in the suffocating darkness, his body immobile from the terrible fall from the fog. He woke up after a day of unconsciousness, his mind hazy, not knowing how long he had been there. The sharp pain from his broken left leg spread throughout his body, and every time he tried to move, he had to grit his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. A gash on his forehead, where he had hit a rock when he fell, left dried blood streaking his tanned face, and his blue eyes were blurred with dehydration and exhaustion. The temperature in the crevice was slightly cooler than outside, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit 7 degrees Celsius, but the stuffy, oxygen-deprived air made it difficult for him to breathe. He survived because of a small gap between the soil and the tree roots, where air from outside filtered in, carrying moisture from the mist that had condensed on the leaves. He caught small drops of water from the damp soil with his hands, taking weak sips to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he knew that if he didn't get help soon, he wouldn't last much longer. In those dreamy hours, Danny thought about Shadow. He remembered the mornings at Sierra Nevada, when he tossed an old tennis ball for Shadow to chase around the training grounds, watching the dog run with strong strides, his muscles defined by his dusty black-brown fur. He remembered the nights in the camp when Shadow would curl up on an old blanket next to his bed, his ears pricking as he whispered to him about his days at Sisters. He remembered the way Shadow's eyes would light up when he looked at him, as if the dog understood everything he didn't say. He wondered if Shadow was safe, if he'd followed the patrol to find shelter, or if he was still somewhere on the ground, waiting for him. He didn't know that Shadow was right above him, just a few feet away, but separated by a thick layer of dirt. He whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Shadow, where are you? If you're alive, find me." But he didn't have the strength to scream, and his voice was drowned out by the oppressive silence in the ravine. On the ground, Shadow faced the cold, the fog, and the loneliness of the wilderness. A few times, a distant noise rang out, a bear moving through the undergrowth, perhaps, or an owl hoot in the night. But Shadow paid no attention to those dangers. He didn't think about hunger, thirst, or the cold that was slowly robbing him of his life. In his mind, there was only Danny, the soldier who had knelt down to stroke his head when they first met, who had shared their cold patrols in the mountains, who had become his family in this strange land. Shadow lay down on the edge of the ravine when the cold of the day became too much, curling up to keep some of his own warmth during the bitter nights, but after a few minutes, he was back up again, scratching and barking, as if not allowing himself to rest. About 3 miles from the ravine, a group of local hunters living near a small town on the edge of the Sierra Nevada heard Shadow's faint barking echoing through the cold wind. They were familiar with the forest, hunting deer in the fall for both food and sport. A man named Mike, a carpenter in his 50s who loved hunting, stood on a low hill, listening to the distant barking, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. He thought it might be a stray dog, but he didn't dare venture too far into the forest, where the fog was still thick, and stories of bears and cougars kept the locals cautious. He returned to the group's camp, sat by a small fire, but still felt a vague unease. He didn't know that the barking belonged to Shadow, a dog fighting cold, thirst, and death to save his master. Down the ravine, Danny began to lose consciousness. He felt his body lighten, as if he were floating in an unknown space. He no longer felt the pain of his broken leg or the stifling cold. Everything was a blur, and his mind drifted to distant memories. He remembered afternoons running on the dirt roads in Sisters, the summer sun filtering through the pine trees, making them glow like blue flames in the woods. He remembered fishing on the Deschutes River with his father, listening to the sound of the water trickling and the smell of fireplace smoke in the air. He remembered mornings in the Sierra Nevada, when he and Shadow patrolled the base, the peace of watching the dog run along the leaf-covered trails. He thought that if he had to die here, at least he had those moments when he felt like his life had mattered. But he didn't want to give up. "Shadow, if you're still there, find me," he whispered to himself. "I trust you." On the ground, Shadow didn't know that Danny was losing hope. He didn't know that the patrol had retreated, that the fog still covered the forest, that no one could hear his barking in the wilderness. But Shadow didn't need to know that. He didn't act on reason or logic. He acted on instinct, on the loyalty that was in the heart of a German shepherd. Shadow stood there in the narrow ravine, a lone figure in a sea of dry leaves and fog, steadfast and unyielding. He didn't leave, didn't give up, even though his body was exhausted, even though the cold and fog were slowly sapping his strength. Shadow knew that Danny was down there, and he would stay until he found him, or until he had no more strength left to continue. 2 days passed, and Shadow was still standing there, living testament to loyalty that transcended all limits. It didn't know that the rescue team from the base would soon return, that its efforts would lead to an unexpected situation. But Shadow didn't need to know that. For it, only one thing mattered: Danny, its companion, its master, the one to whom it had chosen to be loyal since the first day they met. Shadow stood there, in the middle of the Sierra Nevada forest, waiting, hoping, and fighting a German shepherd with a heart that would never give up. 2 days after Danny Harper fell into a narrow ravine in dense fog in California's Sierra Nevada forest, a patrol failed to return immediately to look for him. The persistent fog, combined with the rugged terrain and lack of communication from Danny's broken radio, made initial attempts impossible. The daytime temperature still hovered around 48 degrees Fahrenheit 9 degrees Celsius, and the damp chill of the forest permeated the soil, dead leaves, and air, carrying the scent of pine resin in the still air. Danny lay at the bottom of the ravine in the stifling darkness, his body immobile from his horrific fall. He had awoken from a day-long coma, but now he was drifting into a dreamlike state between life and death. The pain from his broken left leg and the laceration on his forehead had become only a dull ache, as if his body had given up on the pain. The sweat had stopped flowing because he was severely dehydrated, and his blue eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. His breathing was weak in thin wisps that dissipated in the cold air, and he had no strength to move or call for help. He was kept alive by a small gap between the soil and tree roots where the outside air filtered in, carrying moisture from the fog, but he knew his time was running out. On the ground, Shadow still stood at the edge of the ravine, a lone figure in the cold woods. 2 days had passed, and the 75-pound German shepherd was now emaciated and exhausted, his thick black-brown fur matted with dew and dry leaves, matted in hard clumps. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from dew, cold, and fatigue. Its legs trembled, its claws bleeding from deep scratches where it had clawed at the damp earth for 2 days without stopping, leaving small red streaks on the leaf-covered ground. Shadow had no water, no food, only its thick fur to protect it from the cold of the day and the chill of the night, but it did not care. It barked incessantly, its barks growing fainter as the days passed, drowned out by the wind whistling through the pines, but Shadow did not give up. It knew Danny was down there, and it would not leave until it found him. After 2 days, as the fog began to lift in the weak rays of the third morning sun, the rescue team from the small military base in the Sierra Nevada decided to return to the canyon. They had not been able to act sooner because the dense fog and treacherous terrain had made all previous attempts unnecessary risks. But when the weather cleared, Sergeant Robert "Rob" Callahan, Danny's patrol leader, resolutely led the rescue team back. Callahan, a 34-year-old with short black hair, a tanned, angular face, and piercing brown eyes, could not forget the determined look in Shadow's eyes when the dog had refused to leave the ravine 2 days earlier. He knew that if Danny were alive, Shadow would be the key to finding him. The 8-man rescue team, equipped with 2 military jeeps, high-powered headlights, digging tools like shovels and picks, and a medical kit for emergency first aid, left the base early Tuesday morning when the temperature was still in the 50s and the sun was just peeking through the pine trees, casting a pale yellow light through the thin layer of fog that lingered in the air. When the rescue team reached the ravine, they saw Shadow in the distance, a small but determined figure in the middle of the narrow trail. Shadow stood there, almost motionless, his legs shaking with exhaustion, his fur matted with dew and dry leaves, and a trail of dried blood running from his claws to the ground below. Callahan, the leader of the team, stopped and looked at Shadow with amazement and emotion. He couldn't believe that the dog had been there for 2 days, in the damp cold and thick fog, without water or food. He walked closer, knelt before Shadow, and noticed that the dog's red eyes still shone steadfastly, as if pleading with him. "Danny is here. Help me." Shadow no longer had the strength to bark loudly, only making weak, hoarse sounds, then shuffled to the edge of the ravine, pawing at the ground with his bleeding claws as if to show the rescue team where to dig. Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a patrolman and now part of the rescue team, stood next to Callahan, looking at Shadow with tears in her eyes. Sarah, a petite but agile 28-year-old with dark hair tied back and tanned skin, had worked with Danny and Shadow on many patrols. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a pang of pain in her heart when she thought Danny might not make it. But when she saw Shadow, she felt a glimmer of hope. She walked over, knelt down next to Shadow, and stroked his matted fur. She felt his thin, trembling body under her hands, and she knew that Shadow had sacrificed everything to stay here, waiting for Danny. "If he's alive," she whispered to herself, "it's because of you, Shadow." The rescue team quickly got into position. They carried long steel shovels, iron picks, and a handheld leaf blower to clear the dry leaves and dirt that covered the entrance to the ravine. Shadow, exhausted, trudged closer to the edge, clawing at the dirt with his weak claws, as if to help. Callahan ordered the team to concentrate on digging in the area Shadow had indicated, where the dirt bore deep scratches from the dog's claws. He knew Shadow wasn't there for nothing. If Danny was alive, he would be down there. The rescuers worked in silence, the only sounds being the shovels digging into the dirt, the picks breaking through tree roots, and their labored breathing in the cold air. Shadow stood by, his legs shaking, but he didn't move. He looked at the rescuers with a steady gaze, as if pleading with them, "Hurry. He needs us." Down in the ravine, Danny didn't know the rescuers had arrived. He had lost track of time, and his body was in critical condition. The temperature in the crevice was about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius, lower than outside, but the stuffy, oxygen-starved air left him with only feeble gasps. He caught drops of water from the damp soil through the crevice, drinking sips to keep himself from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength to eat or move. His backpack, torn apart when he fell, lay scattered beside him, and his notebook fell out, open to the last page he had written. "It was cold today, but I still walked 8 miles. He had no strength to hold a pen, but he thought Shadow, of the way his dog's eyes glowed whenever he looked at him, and told himself that if Shadow were alive, he would not abandon him. He did not know that Shadow was right above him, leading the rescue team to his rescue. The rescue team worked tirelessly for more than an hour in the cold morning air. They dug through the dead leaves, breaking through the tangled roots, and finally found a narrow opening leading down into the ravine. Callahan bent down, shining a powerful flashlight inside, and the light from the flashlight fell on Danny's pale face. He lay there, motionless, eyes half closed, breathing so weak he could barely see, with dried blood on his forehead and his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Callahan felt his heart sink, but he did not give up hope. "We found him. Hurry," he shouted to the team, widening the entrance, using shovels and their bare hands to clear the dirt, creating a path large enough to pull Danny up. Shadow, exhausted, trudged closer, looking down into the opening with a bright gaze. He had no strength left to bark, but he stood there waiting as if he knew Danny was about to be rescued. Sarah and a paramedic named Mark, a man in his mid-30s with short black hair and strong arms, climbed down into the ravine to check on Danny. They wrapped him in a thermal blanket and checked his pulse and breathing. Mark placed his hand on Danny's neck, felt a faint pulse, and confirmed that he was alive, though in critical condition. "He's alive, but he's weak," he told Sarah. "We need to get him out now." They carefully placed Danny on a stretcher, strapping him in place to avoid further injury. When Danny was pulled to the surface, the faint light of the sun filtered through the fog onto his pale face, and the rescuers breathed a sigh of relief. He was alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the cold, foggy Sierra Nevada ravine. Shadow shuffled over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Danny's face, his red eyes shining faintly but hopefully. Shadow had no strength left to do anything more, but he was still there by Danny's side, as if to make sure he was still alive. Callahan looked at Shadow with awe and emotion. He knelt down beside the dog, stroking its matted fur, feeling its trembling body beneath his hands. He knew that without Shadow, they would never have found Danny in time. "You are a true warrior, Shadow," he whispered to himself. Sarah wiped the dew from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Shadow, saw his emaciated body, his shaking legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Danny. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Shadow. You did the unthinkable." The rescue team quickly treated Danny on the spot. Mark put him on an 4 pumping cool saline solution to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left leg to stabilize it temporarily and wrapped a thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the cold. Danny was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadier and his pulse was becoming more noticeable. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Danny into the jeep to head back to base, Shadow trailed behind, never leaving Danny's side. The dog was so exhausted he could barely walk, but he tried, his legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood on the dry leaves. Sarah looked at Shadow, feeling a pang of pain in her heart. She knew that Shadow needed medical attention, But she also knew that he wouldn't leave Danny until he was sure he was safe. Callahan ordered the team, "Take Shadow with you. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Shadow had done his job, not with strength or skill, but with loyalty beyond measure. 2 days after Danny Harper fell into a narrow ravine in dense fog in California's Sierra Nevada forest, a rescue team from a small military base returned with a faint hope that he was still alive. The thick fog had cleared by Tuesday morning, giving way to weak sunlight filtering through the towering pines, but the chill of the October morning still hung over the area, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius. The air smelled of dry pine needles and damp earth, carried by a light wind that whistled over low, moss-covered cliffs. The 8-man rescue team, equipped with military jeeps, digging tools like shovels and picks, and high-powered headlights, worked tirelessly for more than an hour to break through the thick layer of earth covering the entrance to the ravine where Danny was trapped. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale yellow light through the gaps in the canopy, glistening with the dew that lingered on the pine needles, but not enough to dispel the chill that permeated the team's every breath. Shadow, the German shepherd who had been guarding the ravine for 2 days, was now exhausted, his thin body shivering in the damp chill. His thick black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to withstand the chill of the forest, was caked with dew and dry leaves, matted in hard clumps, revealing the prominent veins on his once lean body. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes were now red from the dew, the cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches where he had clawed at the damp earth for 2 days without rest, leaving small red streaks on the ground. Shadow stood there, almost motionless, but his eyes never left the rescue team, as if waiting for a miracle. He had no strength left to bark loudly, only weak, hoarse sounds, but he still trudged closer to the edge of the ravine, clawing at the ground as if to help, though each movement was an effort beyond his physical limits. Sergeant Rob Callahan, the rescue team leader, stood near Shadow, watching the team work with a mixture of tension and hope. Callahan, a 34-year-old man with short black hair, a sharp face tanned by long hours in the sun, and piercing brown eyes, had seen much loss in his years in the military. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Shadow standing guard for 2 days without food or water, in the cold and thick fog, had filled him with a deep respect. He looked down at the dog, saw its shivering body beneath its frost-coated fur, and thought to himself, "If he lives, you'll be a hero, Shadow." But he didn't dare hope for too much. 2 days in the ravine in the cold and without water was a trial few could have endured, even for a soldier as tough as Danny. Danny lay in the sweltering darkness below the ravine, his body almost motionless, his breathing so faint it was almost inaudible. He had lost track of time, and the 45 degrees Fahrenheit 7 degrees Celsius cold in the ravine, though cooler than outside, was still draining him. The pain from his broken left leg and the gash on his forehead were now only vague sensations, as if his body had become numb to the pain. Sweat no longer flowed because he was severely dehydrated, and his blue eyes were half closed, blurred in the darkness. He survived by a small gap between the soil and the roots, where air from the outside seeped in, carrying moisture from the mist that had condensed on the leaves. He caught small drops of water from the damp soil, taking weak sips to keep his body from becoming completely dehydrated, but he had no strength left to eat or move. In his daze, he thought of Shadow, remembered the dog's bright eyes whenever he looked at him, and whispered to himself with the last of his strength, "Shadow, if you're still there, find me." But he had no strength left to hope for more. On the ground, the rescue team finally broke through the thick layer of dirt covering the entrance to the crevice after more than an hour of nonstop work. Sweat streamed down their faces, seeping through their olive-green uniforms, and dry leaves clung to their arms and shoulders, but no one complained. They widened the narrow opening into an entrance large enough for one person to climb down, and Callahan bent down, shining a high-powered flashlight inside. The light from the lantern illuminated Danny's pale face, highlighting the dried blood on his forehead and his dry, cracked lips. He lay there, motionless, his eyes half closed, his breathing barely visible, his left leg bent at an awkward angle, and his right arm dangling in the damp dirt. Callahan felt his heart sink. He wasn't sure if Danny was alive, but he wouldn't give up. "We found him. Hurry," he shouted to the team, quickly getting into position, preparing to lift Danny to the surface. Corporal Saringwin and Medic Mark, a man in his mid-30s with short black hair and strong arms, volunteered to climb down the ravine to check on Danny. Sarah climbed down first, her hands shaking from the cold as she clung to the roots and the slippery, damp soil in the ravine. She knelt down next to Danny, placing her hand on his neck to check his pulse. His pulse was weak, but still beating, a fragile sign of life. She felt a surge of hope, but she also knew that Danny was in dire straits. She looked at his pale face, saw his dry lips and half-closed eyes, and felt a pang of pain. She had patrolled with Danny, knew him to be a patient soldier who kept his cool in difficult situations, and she whispered to herself, "You have to live, Danny. Shadow didn't abandon you, and neither will we." Mark, who climbed down after Sarah, carried a thermal blanket and a small medical kit. He checked Danny's breathing, placed his hand on his chest to feel for him, and confirmed that he was alive though weak. "He's severely dehydrated," he told Sarah, "and his leg is badly broken. We need to get him out now." Sarah and Mark carefully placed Danny on a stretcher, strapping him in with straps to avoid further injury. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, trying to protect his body from the cold while the rescue team above pulled the stretcher up. When Danny was pulled to the surface, the pale light of the sun shone on his pale face, highlighting the dried blood and cracked skin from dehydration. The rescue team breathed a sigh of relief to see him alive, a miracle after 2 days trapped in the cold and fog of the Sierra Nevada. Shadow, exhausted, trudged over to the stretcher, bent down to sniff Danny's face. His red eyes lit up faintly, but hopefully, as if he knew Danny had been saved. Shadow had no strength left to bark, but he put his head on Danny's hand, feeling the faint warmth of his body, and stood still beside him, as if to make sure he was still alive. Callahan watched the scene, feeling a surge of emotion. He knelt down beside Shadow, stroking the dog's matted fur, and feeling its trembling body beneath his hand. He knew that without Shadow, they would never have found Danny in time. He thought to himself, "You did the unthinkable, Shadow." Sarah, standing next to Callahan, wiped the dew from her face, not to clean it, but to hide the tears of emotion. She looked at Shadow, saw his emaciated body, his trembling legs, and his bleeding claws, and knew that the dog had sacrificed everything to save Danny. She whispered to herself, "Thank you, Shadow. You are a true hero." The rescue team quickly administered first aid to Danny on the spot. Mark put him on in 4, pumping him with cool saline to help his body fight dehydration. They examined his injuries, confirming that he had a broken left leg and a deep laceration on his forehead, but no signs of internal bleeding, a blessing given the circumstances. They placed a pad under his left leg to stabilize it, and wrapped another layer of thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the bitter cold. Danny was still unconscious, but his breathing was steadier, and his pulse was more noticeable thanks to the saline. The rescue team knew they needed to get him back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then to a larger military hospital. As the rescue team prepared to load Danny into a jeep to head back to base, Shadow struggled to his feet and follow. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, his claws leaving small trails of blood in the dry leaves. It didn't have the strength to go fast, but it tried, as if it didn't want to leave Danny's side for even a second. Sarah looked at Shadow, feeling a pang in her heart. She pulled an old coat from her pack, an olive green army jacket, frayed at the cuffs, and wrapped it around Shadow to protect him from the cold. She stroked his head, feeling the frosted fur beneath her hands, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She knew Shadow needed medical attention, but she also knew he wouldn't leave Danny until he was safe. "Put Shadow in the jeep next to Danny," Callahan ordered. "He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Mark and another member of the rescue team, Private First Class Jake Miller, a young man of 24 with light blonde hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Shadow and placed him in the jeep next to Danny's stretcher. Shadow didn't protest. He was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Sarah's coat tighter around Shadow and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the car door. Shadow lay close to Danny, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. He didn't have the strength to bark or move, but he was there next to Danny, as if to make sure he was safe. In Danny's heart, even though he was still unconscious, a vague feeling crept into his mind. He didn't know that the rescue team had found him, that Shadow had been standing guard for 2 days, leading them here. But in his hazy dreams, he saw Shadow, his eyes shining, standing in the misty woods, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew the dog would never abandon him. That miraculous moment, when Danny was pulled from the ravine, alive after 2 days trapped in the cold and fog, was not only a miracle of survival, but also a testament to Shadow's unwavering loyalty, the German shepherd who refused to abandon his companion. As the rescue team from a small military base in the Sierra Nevada pulled Danny Harper from a narrow ravine in the cold woods, the damp chill of the October morning was still palpable on the third day since he went missing. The temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, and a light breeze blew through the area, carrying moisture from the receding fog and the smell of damp earth from the towering pines. Danny lay unconscious on a stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips cracked from dehydration, and his weak breaths came in thin wisps that dissipated in the chill air. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in a silver thermal blanket, administered fluids through and for to combat his severe dehydration, and immobilized his broken left leg with a hard plastic pad and medical tape. But as they worked, Shadow, the German shepherd who had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, plodded closer, never leaving Danny's side. Shadow was now a shadow of his former self. His thick, black-brown fur, once carefully groomed to protect against the cold of the forest, was caked with dew and dry leaves, matted in stiff clumps, revealing the thin, shivering body beneath. Shadow's ears were still erect, but one was slightly scratched, and his bright brown eyes, once intelligent and determined, were red from dew, cold, and exhaustion. His legs trembled, and his claws bled from deep scratches he had made from scratching the damp soil for 2 days without rest, leaving small red streaks on the leaf-covered ground. Shadow had no strength left to walk fast, but he trudged closer to Danny's stretcher, bending down to sniff his face, as if to make sure he was still alive. As the rescue team laid Danny down to bandage him and prepare him for the jeep, Shadow lay close to the stretcher, using his body to shield Danny from the cold winds that blew through the area. The rescue team looked at Shadow with awe and emotion. Sergeant Rob Callahan, the team leader, stood nearby, watching the dog with awe in his sharp brown eyes. Callahan, a 34-year-old man with short black hair and a tanned, angular face, had seen much in his military career, from dangerous patrols to inevitable loss. He was not an emotional man, but the sight of Shadow lying so close to Danny, using his thin body to shield him, made him feel a pang of pain. He looked at the dog's trembling body, saw the frosted fur and the dried blood on its claws, and knew that Shadow had sacrificed everything to save Danny. No food, no water, no rest for 2 days in the cold and thick fog. He knelt beside Shadow, stroked its frosted fur, felt its thin, trembling body beneath his hands. "You did what none of us could," he thought. "You're a real warrior." Corporal Sarah Nguyen, a member of the rescue team, stood next to Callahan, looking at Shadow with tears in her eyes. Sarah, a petite but agile 28-year-old with dark hair tied back in a tan, had patrolled with Danny and Shadow on many missions in the Sierra Nevada. She knew the bond between them, and she felt a deep emotion when she saw Shadow lying close to Danny, shielding him from the cold wind with her body. She knelt down next to Shadow, took an old coat from her pack, an olive green military jacket, frayed at the cuffs and soaked with sweat from days of patrol, and wrapped it around the dog to protect him from the cold and the dew. She stroked Shadow's head, feeling the dewy fur beneath her hand, and saw his red eyes looking at her with determination. She whispered to herself, "You did everything to save him, Shadow. Now it's our turn to take care of you." While the rescue team bandaged Danny, Shadow did not move from his position. The dog lay close to the stretcher, his body pressed tightly against the edge of the stretcher, like a living wall separating Danny from the cold wind blowing through the area. Shadow's legs trembled. The strong muscles that had once made him run like the wind on the trails around the base now shrunk from the cold and lack of water. He no longer had the strength to stand, but he still tried, using his last bit of strength to protect Danny. The rescue team saw this action, and a feeling of admiration welled up in their hearts. Mark, the team's medical officer, a man of about 32 with short black hair and strong hands, was bandaging Danny's left leg and looked up at Shadow. He shook his head in amazement, thinking to himself, "I've never seen a dog like this." Not only did he save him, but he protected him to the very end. Danny, still unconscious, didn't know that Shadow was beside him, protecting him from the cold and wind of the forest. He didn't feel the faint warmth of Shadow's thin body, didn't hear the dog's panting as it struggled to keep its position. But in his hazy dream, he saw Shadow, his eyes glowing, standing in the middle of the misty woods, waiting for him. He felt a strange comfort, as if he knew the dog would never abandon him. In his heart, though he couldn't consciously realize it, a warm feeling crept into his mind, as if he knew he wasn't alone. The rescue team finished bandaging Danny, securing his left leg with a makeshift splint made of hard plastic and medical tape, and wrapping a thermal blanket around his body to protect him from the bitter cold. They checked his breathing and pulse, finding them slightly more stable thanks to the cool saline solution being pumped through his veins. But they knew that Danny needed to be taken back to base immediately, where he could receive proper medical care, and then transferred to a larger military hospital. They loaded Danny into a military jeep, a vehicle designed for rugged mountain terrain, with olive green paint and large tires designed to traverse trails covered in dry leaves and loose rocks. The vehicle was covered with a blue tarp to protect it from the wind and cold, and Danny was placed on a soft mattress to minimize vibrations during the ride. As the rescue team prepared to leave, Shadow struggled to his feet to follow Danny. The dog shuffled along, legs shaking, claws leaving small trails of blood on the dry leaves. He didn't have the strength to walk fast, but he tried, as if he didn't want to leave Danny's side for even a second. Sarah looked at Shadow, feeling a pang in her heart. She knew the dog needed immediate medical attention, but she also knew that he wouldn't leave Danny until she was sure he was safe. She knelt down next to Shadow, stroked his head, and said to Callahan, "We need to take Shadow with us. He can't stay here." Callahan nodded, ordering the team, "Put Shadow in the jeep, next to Danny. He's done enough. We'll take care of them both." Mark and Jake Miller, a young man of 24 with light blonde hair and a cheerful disposition, carefully lifted Shadow up, placing him in the jeep next to Danny's stretcher. Shadow didn't protest. It was too weak to do anything but lie down. They wrapped Sarah's coat tighter around Shadow and placed a small blanket over him to protect him from the cold wind coming through the car door. Shadow lay close to Danny, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher, his red eyes watching him with determination. It had no strength left to bark or move, but it was there, next to Danny, as if to make sure he was safe. The rescue team set off, the jeep moving over rough trails, heading for the base 5 miles away, where a medical team was waiting to take Danny and Shadow. The cold wind still blew, carrying dry leaves that clung to the canvas of the car, but inside, Shadow lay close to Danny, its thin body radiating a faint warmth. Callahan sat in the front, looking back at Shadow and Danny, feeling a surge of emotion. He knew that Shadow's protective actions were more than instinct. It was loyalty beyond all bounds, a deep friendship between a dog and its owner. "If he's alive, it's because of you, Shadow," he thought. Sarah sat next to Shadow, stroking his head, feeling his weak breathing under her hand. She looked at Danny, saw his pale face regaining some color from the saline solution, and hoped that he would wake up. She looked at Shadow, saw his red eyes still looking at Danny, and she knew that the dog had done all he could. "Thank you, Shadow," she whispered to herself. "You saved him, and we're going to save you." As the jeep moved through the Sierra Nevada woods, Shadow lay there, next to Danny, a living testament to loyalty and friendship that endured the test of cold, fog, and danger. After being pulled from a narrow ravine in the Sierra Nevada forest of California by rescuers, Danny Harper, and Shadow were loaded into a military jeep and driven to a small base 5 miles away. The damp chill of the October morning still hung over the area, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius, and a light breeze blew, carrying dry leaves that clung to the vehicle's olive green tarpaulin. Danny lay unconscious on the stretcher, his face pale with streaks of dried blood on his forehead, his lips dry and cracked, and his broken left leg temporarily immobilized with a plastic pad. And 4 was hooked up to his arm, dripping cool saline solution to counteract his severe dehydration. Shadow lay close to the stretcher, his emaciated body trembling, his black-brown fur matted with dew and dry leaves, his red eyes fixed on Danny with determination. The rescue team, led by Sergeant Rob Callahan, sat around them, eyes a mixture of worry and hope as the vehicle rolled over the rough trails toward the base. The journey back to the base took about 20 minutes, and when the jeep pulled up in the base yard, a large plot of land surrounded by barbed wire and towering pine trees, a medical team was waiting. Danny was rushed into the base's medical shed, a small corrugated roofed room with wooden walls, containing a few medical beds, a medicine cabinet, and an old air conditioner that were to alleviate the cold outside. Nurses in olive green uniforms began to assess his condition, diagnosing him with severe dehydration, a broken left leg, and a deep laceration on his forehead. His skin was pale, his breathing was shallow, and his body was shivering despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. They gave him more saline intravenously, put him under a fan to cool him down, and took x-rays with a handheld machine to determine the extent of the damage to his leg. The base doctors decided he needed to be transported to a larger military hospital for treatment, and a U-860 Black Hawk helicopter was called in to take him to a military hospital in Sacramento, more than 150 miles away. Shadow, meanwhile, was taken to a separate area on the base reserved for working animals. A veterinarian named Linda, a woman in her mid-30s with light brown hair tied back and soft blue eyes, examined the dog. Shadow weighed about 65 pounds, nearly 10 pounds less than before the accident, having not eaten or drank anything for 2 days in the cold and fog. His black-brown fur was caked with dew and dried leaves, his eyes were red, and his claws were bleeding from deep scratches. Linda checked Shadow's heart and breathing, finding them weak but steady, and confirmed that the dog was severely weakened by hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. She gave Shadow fluids through and for, pumped him with a nutrient solution to give him energy, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool shed. She bandaged the scratches on Shadow's claws and gently trimmed away the matted fur to clean up his body. But Linda noticed that Shadow's eyes kept darting toward the medical shed, as if searching for Danny. The flight from the Sierra Nevada to Sacramento took a little over 45 minutes. Danny was placed on a medical stretcher in the helicopter's cabin, wrapped in thermal blankets, with a small oxygen tube attached to his nose to aid his breathing. Shadow was placed next to him in a metal transport cage, his thin body lying on a soft mattress, his red eyes peering through the metal bars to watch Danny. The helicopter lifted off into the dim morning light, the roar of the engines drowning out all other sounds, and as they flew over the mountains and valleys, the chill of the Sierra Nevada gave way to the warmer air of the California plains. When the helicopter landed at the Sacramento Military Hospital in mid-morning, the temperature was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius, a welcome change from the cold mountain forest Danny and Shadow had just left. At the Sacramento Military Hospital, Danny was taken to the intensive care unit. He was placed on a hospital bed with a metal railing, in a small room with white walls, frosted glass windows overlooking a parking lot, and modern medical equipment such as a heart monitor and a backup ventilator. Doctors diagnosed him with severe dehydration, a broken left femur, and a laceration on his forehead that required stitches. They performed minor surgery to fix the femur with a metal rod and splint, and stitched the laceration on his forehead with 10 medical stitches. An oxygen tube was placed in his nose, and an IV drip hung from a metal rack next to the bed, providing nutrients and pain medication. For the first 3 days, Danny remained in a coma, his body so weak that doctors feared the damage from dehydration might be affecting his brain, but they hoped he would wake up as his body recovered. Shadow was cared for in an animal ward in the hospital, about 50 meters from Danny's room. Linda, the veterinarian from the base, accompanied the flight to continue monitoring the dog's condition. Shadow was placed on a soft cushion examination table in a small room with white walls and a clean tile floor. Linda administered 4 fluids to Shadow, feeding him small meals of soft, protein-rich foods like ground chicken mixed with rice to help him regain his strength. She cleaned Shadow's matted fur with warm water and mild soap, bandaged the scratches on his claws, and placed him under a heat lamp to keep him warm in the cool Sacramento air. Shadow recovered, his body stopped shaking, and his red eyes began to brighten, but his gaze was constantly directed toward the door, as if waiting for Danny. On the 3rd day at the hospital, Danny began to show signs of waking up. He opened his eyes slowly, the white light from the ceiling shining into his eyes, causing him to blink repeatedly to adjust. He felt a dull ache in his left leg and forehead, but the pain was not as intense as before. He looked around, seeing the white walls, the hospital bed, and the 4 hanging beside him. He couldn't remember what had happened, only vague images of the fog, the stifling cold in the crevice, and Shadow's eyes in his mind. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak, and a young nurse named Emily, a girl of about 23 with blonde hair tied back and soft brown eyes, quickly came over, placing her hands on his shoulders to keep him down. She told him in a gentle voice that he had been saved, that he was in a hospital in Sacramento, and that he needed to rest. Danny didn't say anything, but in his mind a single question arose: where's Shadow? When Danny woke up, the rescue team notified Linda, and she decided to take Shadow to his room. Shadow, though still weak, regained some of his strength under Linda's care. Its fur was cleaned, its claws bandaged, and its thin body no longer trembled. Linda led Shadow on a leash through the long hallways of the hospital, with its white tile floors and the smell of antiseptic in the air, to Danny's room. When the door opened, Shadow saw Danny lying on the bed, and its brown eyes were shining weakly but hopefully. The dog shuffled over to the bed, pulling on the leash in Linda's hand, and placed its head on Danny's. Danny looked down, saw Shadow, and felt a surge of emotion. He reached out to stroke Shadow's head, feeling the soft fur under his hand, and whispered to himself, You saved me, Shadow. Thank you. From then on, Shadow stayed with Danny throughout his hospital stay. The nurses set up a small mat in the corner of the room for Shadow, and the dog lay there, never leaving Danny's side. Every day, Linda came to check on Shadow, feeding him small meals and changing the bandages on his claws. Shadow gradually regained his strength, his fur began to shine again, and his skinny body began to fill out. But his eyes never left Danny. Whenever a stranger entered the room, Shadow stood up, ears perked up, as if to protect him. Danny, meanwhile, recovered slowly. He underwent physical therapy to regain strength in his left leg, and although the wound on his forehead had healed, he still felt a dull ache when he moved. He was still weak, but every day he felt better and he knew that he was alive because of Shadow. During his days in the hospital, Danny thought about what had happened. He remembered the fog, the stifling cold in the crevice, and the despair of knowing he would never escape. He remembered the hazy dreams of Shadow, the dog's bright eyes in the misty woods. He didn't know exactly what Shadow had done to save him, but he felt the dog's loyalty in every moment. He looked at Shadow, saw the dog lying on the rug in the corner of the room, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. I owe you my life, Shadow, he whispered to himself. I will never forget that. The story of Danny and Shadow spread through the military hospital in Sacramento, and then to their unit in the Sierra Nevada. The nurses said that Shadow never left Danny's side, that the dog stood up whenever a stranger entered the room, as if to protect him. The doctors said that Danny's survival was a miracle, that he had surpassed the limits of the human body because of Shadow's will and loyalty. Callahan, Sarah, and the other rescuers visited Danny when they were transferred to Sacramento to report, bringing congratulations and admiration. They told him of Shadow's loyalty, how he had stood guard at the edge of the ravine for 2 days, leading them to him to save him. Danny listened, his eyes filling with tears, and he stroked Shadow's head, feeling the warmth of his body beneath his hands. After 4 weeks in the hospital, Danny was released. He still needed crutches to get around because his left leg was not fully healed, but he was well enough to leave Sacramento. Shadow, now stronger, walked beside him, his black-brown fur shiny, his ears erect, and his eyes as bright as ever. He left the hospital with a deep sense of gratitude, not just for being alive, but for having Shadow by his side, the companion who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. He knew that his journey of recovery was not just physical, but also spiritual, and Shadow helped him find meaning in life again. After 4 weeks of treatment at the military hospital in Sacramento, Danny Harper was discharged on a morning in early November 2024. The air in Sacramento was cool, with temperatures hovering around 60 degrees Fahrenheit 16 degrees Celsius, and a light breeze carried the scent of dried leaves from the trees outside the hospital across the military parking lot. Danny walked out of the hospital building, leaning on a crutch in his right arm, his left leg still weak from surgery to stabilize his femur. He wore a new olive-green military jacket that Sarah and Gwen had given him, a thick gray sweater and dark blue jeans. His face was still pale, with a faint scar on his forehead from a healed laceration, but his blue eyes were brighter, shining with a determination and gratitude he had never known before. Beside him, Shadow walked slowly, his black-brown fur restored from the days of care at the hospital. The 75-pound German Shepherd was now strong, with erect ears and bright brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and loyalty. Shadow stayed by Danny's side, never leaving his side, as if knowing that his mission to protect him was not over. Danny decided not to return to the Sierra Nevada or to continue his military career. After the tragedy in the Misty Woods, he realized that his life needed a new direction, one that was not only for himself, but also for Shadow, the companion who would save his life. He applied for early retirement from the military, citing his health as no longer fit for active duty, and was granted it after doctors determined that his left leg injury, though partially healed, would leave him permanently disabled, preventing him from patrolling or performing physically demanding tasks. He felt no regrets. The military had given him purpose over the years, but Shadow had given him a reason to live. He packed his belongings from the Sierra Nevada base. His comrades had sent him to Sacramento after the incident, including his father's old backpack, his small folding knife, and the small notebook he'd used to jot down his scattered thoughts, and set off for Sisters, Oregon, where his mother, Ellen, was waiting. The journey from Sacramento to Sisters took more than 8 hours, all by car, because Danny didn't want Shadow to endure another flight in a transport cage. He rented a black Toyota pickup in Sacramento, put Shadow in a passenger seat, and drove home through the winding highways between the pine forests and valleys of Northern California and Oregon. Shadow sat still, his head resting on the seat, his eyes half closed but alert to any outside sounds. Danny stopped several times along the way at small rest stops, buying sandwiches and water for himself, and taking some dry food from his pack to give to Shadow. At each stop, Shadow got out of the car and walked beside him, ears pricked as if to make sure he was safe. When they reached Sisters in the late afternoon, the cool Oregon air greeted them, with temperatures around 55 degrees Fahrenheit 13 degrees Celsius and pale sunlight filtering through the tall pines, illuminating the familiar red dirt roads. Danny drove through the winding streets of Sisters, past lush pine forests and small wooden houses dotted along the way. He stopped in front of the family's old wooden house, where his mother, Ellen, stood on the porch, wearing a pale blue sweater and a gray scarf. Ellen, now 56, with white hair and blue eyes like Danny's, stepped out to greet him, her hands shaking with emotion. She held Danny tightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she saw him alive, though he was still weak and on crutches. She didn't know much about what had happened in the Sierra Nevada, only that he had been in danger and saved. When she saw Shadow get out of the car and walk beside Danny, she knelt down and stroked his head, feeling the soft fur under her hand. "Thank you for bringing my son back," she whispered to herself. Danny decided to use his savings from his time in the military to renovate the family's cabin in Sisters, rather than buy a new place. The house was a one-story house with a steep red-tiled roof, weathered wood walls, and a large backyard where Shadow could run around freely. He fixed it up with the help of his sister Emily, who drove from Eugene to visit him after hearing about the incident. Emily, a 27-year-old with pale blonde hair and blue eyes like his, didn't say much, but she spent her days helping Danny repaint the walls white, replace leaky shingles, and build a low wooden fence around the yard. Danny and Shadow moved into the house in late November, when the pine forest around Sisters began to be covered with a thin layer of winter fog, and the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, brightening their small yard. Every afternoon, Danny and Shadow took walks on the dirt roads around Sisters. Danny needed crutches for the first few months, but he gradually abandoned them as his left leg healed through physical therapy at a small clinic in town. He walked slowly, taking in the crisp fall air, the scent of dry earth and pine needles filling his nostrils. Shadow walked beside him, ears perked, eyes bright, occasionally darting a few steps ahead to sniff the grass along the road or chase a passing squirrel. Danny looked at Shadow, feeling a peace he had never known before. He thought of the days in the Sierra Nevada, of the cold patrols in the mountains, of the fog that had almost taken his life, and how Shadow had stood guard at the edge of a ravine for 2 days to save him. He knew he would never forget Shadow's loyalty, and he decided to spend the rest of his life caring for the dog, a friend who had not abandoned him in his hour of need. The story of Danny and Shadow spread through the local community in Sisters and Danny's old military unit in the Sierra Nevada. Neighbors and sisters who had known Danny since he was a child came to visit him, bringing gifts like baked goods and homemade honey. They sat in his yard, listening to him tell the story of Shadow and the loyalty of the dog that saved his life. They watched Shadow, now healthy and happy, run around a yard and felt a deep sense of. In the Sierra Nevada, Sergeant Rob Callahan, Corporal Seringwin, and other members of the rescue team told the story to new recruits, making Danny and Shadow symbols of loyalty and camaraderie in the unit. Callahan even offered to award Shadow a military medal of honor, but Danny declined in a brief letter from Oregon, saying that Shadow didn't need a medal, he just needed him. Shadow, now 4 years old, lived happily with Danny in the cabin in Sisters. The dog no longer had to face the harsh cold of the mountains or the dangers of fog and rugged terrain. Instead, he lived a peaceful life, running around in the yard, lying on the porch while Danny read on an old wooden chair, and walking with him on the red dirt roads. Danny cared for Shadow with all his love and gratitude, feeding him nutritious meals like ground beef mixed with rice, taking him to the vet at Sisters regularly, and petting his head every night before bed. He looked at Shadow, saw the light in his eyes, and felt that he had found the true meaning of life not in military missions or months of running away from Sisters, but in the deep friendship with Shadow. For Danny, the tragedy in the Sierra Nevada was not just a painful memory, but also a profound lesson. He learned that loyalty can transcend all boundaries, that the friendship between humans and animals is a bond that is strong and worthy of respect. He learned that perseverance can lead to hope, that Shadow did not give up on him even when everything seemed hopeless. And he learned that four-legged friends like Shadow deserve to be loved and cared for, not just because of what they do for us, but because they are a part of our lives. Every time Danny looked at Shadow, he whispered in his heart, "Thank you, Shadow. I will never forget what you did for me." Danny and Shadow's story ended in peace and happiness, but the lesson from it remained forever. It was a lesson about Shadow's absolute loyalty, when the dog did not give up on Danny even in the face of cold, thirst, and danger. It's a lesson in enduring friendship, as Danny and Shadow's bond overcomes all odds to become a living testament to the bond between humans and animals. It's a lesson in perseverance leading to hope, as Shadow stands guard for 2 days to lead the rescue team to Danny's rescue. And it's a lesson in appreciating four-legged friends, as Shadow not only saves Danny's life, but helps him find meaning in life again. Danny and Shadow live together in the cabin in Sisters, a testament to friendship that transcends all boundaries, a story that four-legged loyalty will forever tell to honor loyal dogs like Shadow.